We have to understand that what's going on this planet would go on any planet anywhere where there was a sentient, so-called intelligent species that's populating and influencing its environment at the magnitude, that we do.
Dear brothers and sisters, my warmest welcome to our podcast, Creativity and Crisis. My name is Dr. Glen Martin. These series of podcasts have been created in honor of my newest book called The Earth Constitution Solution, Designed for a Living Planet. For a number of years, I've been president of the World Constitution and Parliament Association, an organization working to address our planetary crises and to establish an enduring and liberating world future. I'm also a philosopher by profession who loves thinking, creative vision, and inspiring ideas. In these podcasts, I engage in dialogue with prominent thinkers, scholars, and activists who are similarly concerned about the multitude of crises confronting humanity. Are there creative and practical solutions, and how can these be achieved? I hope our listeners will both stay with us and join us in the thought processes that have become an utterly necessary part of our quest to create a decent planetary civilization for everyone. My Creativity and Crisis guest today is Dr. Kurt Johnson. Kurt has worked in professional science and comparative religion for over 40 years and serves on many international committees, particularly at the United Nations. As part of Unity Earth, he co-edits two magazines, one called The Convergence and the other called Light on Light. He co-hosts the Convergence series on Voice America. In comparative culture and religion, Kurt has been on the faculty of New York City's One Spirit Faith Seminary for 12 years and is co-author of the very influential 2013 book on the future of the world's religions called The Coming Interspiritual Age. In science, with a PhD in evolution, ecology, and comparative biology, he was on the staff of the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years and is currently associated with the McGuire Center for Biodiversity at the University of Florida. Kurt has published over 200 scientific articles and 7 books, including the popular science bestseller called Nabokov's Blues, The Scientific Odyssey of a Literary Genius. In 2015, his book on science and the art called Fine Lines appeared at Yale University Press, along with contributions in a United Nations NGO publication called Ethics, Spiritual Values, and the New United Nations Development Agenda. Wonderful. Welcome, Dr. Kurt Johnson.
We, very much like any other planet anywhere in the universe, are making this transition from having an intelligent species that has been tribal and clan-based and then nation-based and all of these identity allegiances, which go so deeply even into conflict and violence. And now we're in a situation, not only sociologically, but with regard to the environment, that if we can't go global in a cosmopolitan way, that actually works for the good of the whole and takes care of people and planet, then we're not going to make the transition that will really save us from what would almost be an inevitable extinction. So just to, frame that, and then to say that the challenge that we have, which thought leaders like yourself and many others are taking up, is that we have to become aware that we're at this threshold point. If we're not aware and we just go on with business as usual, then this will take us someplace we don't want to go, but we're not going to know that until hindsight, until it's too late. So it's just such an extremely urgent time.
So if I understand what you're saying, it's kind of a civilizational maturity that we're looking for, or, our fundamental problem is kind of our human identity. Rather than being clan-based or nation-based, we need to begin thinking as a species-based. Is that the central thing?
Yeah, absolutely. As you've prefaced, people know that I'm, among many other things, a good hard scientist with a PhD in evolution and ecology. In that context, it's really an anthropological issue. It's an evolutionary anthropological issue, whether any species, once it's populated the globe at the level that we have, and with the type of activities that affect the environment in the way that ours do, it will either make it through that threshold relative to its maturity of how it treats other people and also the planet, or it will just dissolve into anarchy, catastrophe, and just a downward spiral. So that I kind of always look at it as an anthropological threshold.
As we both know, there have been many species that have gone into overshoot, right? Maybe not on a planetary scale, but they've overshot their environment. They've faced tremendous die-offs. Throughout the history of evolution, this is a fairly common thing. So now human beings are faced with this same dynamic. We've multiplied perhaps beyond the carrying capacity of the earth. We have not respected the earth in terms of our use of it for natural resources and production and consumption and energy use and so on. So we're facing this kind of environmental crisis, in which case we as human beings, I think, as you're pointing out, we have the self-awareness that earlier species did not have, that might just be our saving grace, our saving feature. Because we're self-aware, that means perhaps we can change more quickly.
Absolutely, because the evolutionary principle that's behind all this is that's what's adaptive in one time period becomes maladaptive in another, and vice versa. So what serves a species adaptively at one time will then eventually can reverse on it, and then it becomes maladaptive. So the real question then, like you just said, is whether our species can be conscious enough to assess those things and not just fall into lemming-like patterns, which would then just drive us towards something that we can't educate ourselves out of, we can't adapt or innovate ourselves out of. And that's the big danger.
Let me ask you this. How is that connected with what you said initially about our need to become a planetary species? Is there our kind of limited consciousness now? Is that connected with the environmental crisis as well?
Absolutely, because what happens is that things that have short-term adaptive value, like being all just about your country, all about yourself, allegiance to this or that identity, not thinking about the good of the whole, even telling lies like in conspiracy theories and all of these false narratives,
Right.
those have a short-term adaptive value because one of the habits of primates, we like things that are simple, they're easy to repeat, slogans, mottos. We don't like to think big picture. We like things that are simple. It's one of our inheritances. So one of the problems then in this not seeing what's become maladaptive is that we start acting in those ways, which then have a short-term adaptive value, as we've seen with what certain politicians do. They pull people into a big lie, and that has a short-term advantage for a certain group, but it has a
No.
gigantic long-term maladaptive value for everyone. And again, if we aren't able to see that at a global level, and then in a sense police that, so that we don't have these false narratives that are guiding our decision making, then we're just creating issues that are just, they're mammoth.
Yes, yes. And one of the things that comes to my mind as you're talking about that is our adaptivity, our ability to assess the fact that we might be in overshoot. We have too many people for the carrying capacity of the planet and so on. And our activities, our burning of fossil fuel, our need for immense energy sources and so on. This is something that does not simply, it would seem, need to adapt to an environmental situation, but the environmental situation itself is rapidly changing. It's rapidly declining. I might wonder is there more than adaptation? We have to, in a way, envision the decline of the global environment, its capacity to carry people on this earth in a sustainable way is disappearing rapidly. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that's pointed out now, certainly both in evolutionary biology and its implications in consciousness and spirituality, is that if a species like ours does not get in the driver's seat of its own evolution and realize that because it's an intelligent species, it can get in the driver's seat. I mean, Teilhard de Chardin, that was his entire cosmology, and the group in science now that's saying that Teilhard's cosmology is the cosmology that we want and need, even aside from its religious aspect. But it's the cosmology we need because it says if we do not get in the driver's seat of the direction of our own conscious evolution by conscious choice, then it will, like I said, likely take us somewhere we don't want to go, but we're not going to know that until it's too late. So I think, like you said, Glenn, this is a time where, everybody needs to be aware, and I think particularly young people who are growing up, that if we're not in that proactive situation about our future and proactive about the directions of everything across all the areas of infrastructure, whether it includes energy and the environment and sociological issues and social justice issues, if we're not proactive about how those are going in a conscious direction, then we're going to end up with a plethora of problems that A, we didn't anticipate, and B, we don't know how to deal with. I mean, it's very simple. If you go to a doctor and the doctor doesn't get the diagnosis right, he can't offer the right prescription.
Right.
And that's the same metaphor. And this is also then what you've said in your book. I mean, what's important about your book is that this threshold of global governance is going to have to be crossed at some point if we're going to successfully globalize in a way that's earth friendly and people friendly. The problem is for people like yourself who are very ahead of your time, you're having to say things to people, particularly about sovereignty, which is probably one of the most difficult things to ever have go away, as we've just seen with Afghanistan and countless other examples. But when a person like yourself starts pioneering that conversation way in advance of most people's developmental level to understand it, then we're probably up against, decades of blind pushback, all based. And we've seen that in the COVID crisis, the type of pushback against the vaccines, which is actually, really irrational, if not insane.
Yes.
And based on counterfactual data sets that are all over the place, then we just create, more problems. And I know one of the things in one of the most major books on evolution in the last year or two was saying that we did not anticipate the power of counterfactual narratives. Because the truth is, again, as they say, you could have a positive counterfactual narrative,
right,
and you could use that to guide a society toward a wonderful planet, let's say believing in the fairy godmother or the Easter bunny, and it would work as long as it was ethically and morally sound.
Yeah.
It wouldn't even need to be true. Fortunately, we do have understandings from our great wisdom traditions and our evolutionary principles that would guide us forward in the right way, in a factual way. And just as a note, when David Sloan Wilson and I were at the Dalai Lama's 2 years ago, having this discussion, this was exactly what they agreed upon, that we have to come into this natural alliance in consciousness between the best awarenesses of the great wisdom traditions and the principles of science, and have those be the yin and the yang that guides us forward toward a positive future with a factual narrative, though one could do it with a non-factual narrative.
Right. Ramon Panikar, whose theology books I've read for many years, he speaks of human beings as a microcosm, and to realize a part of the awareness, you were speaking early on in our conversation about the need for a planetary consciousness, planetary maturity, but he says we need a cosmic consciousness as well. We really need a sense that the cosmos has, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, has come to consciousness in us. Therefore, it's not just sort of a kind of a human ego that says, oh, I've got to get what my country needs or myself needs or my family needs, but it's a sense of we're part of something deeply mysterious and deeply holy, maybe sacred, that really needs to be in the depths of our awareness if we're going to transform in a proper way. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it may, and actually even 3 different points. One of the great privileges of my life was to sit on a couple boards with Ramon when he was still with us. We were on one of the early boards on the future of holistic medicine.
Well, that's fantastic.
And so it was a delight to know him personally. But yeah, also to say, see, one of the things we all understand is when we're children and we haven't had life beat out of us, our sense of awe, wonder, and the natural idealism that comes with the connection to just being and consciousness and nature, we naturally have this idealism that arises in us because of this connection that we have, and that gets beaten out of us over time, where we become callous and jaded and on and on. We've got to find a way at a global level to tap back into what you said, that sense of devotion, that sense of reverence that sense of the sacred, which is the welcoming of everything and the understanding of the absolute value of everything, and not just measures in materiality and measures in growth and measures in money. So we have something in our nature that gets stamped out of us very early in life by the way that we're all brought up, which then, really works against us. And then the third comment I was going to make is Ken Wilber, of course, says the same thing, along with Rianne Eisler and others who are talking about we're entering this period now where we're naturally trying to create the global world-centric integral view. But then understanding that that's under the larger umbrella of the cosmocentric view. We have to understand that what's going on this planet would go on any planet anywhere where there was a sentient, so-called intelligent species that's populating and influencing its environment at the magnitude, that we do. And I know Claudia Wells, who's the chair at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, said that the first question that she would ask any advanced ET, if there is such a thing, and if such a being would ever land and talk to us, was, how did you get by that threshold? How did your planet get by that threshold? And not only do we have that threshold, which is the global one of our cosmopolitan community, but we've got the one of technology. What happens when our technology, like in AI and other capabilities, exceeds our ability in our ideals, morals, and ethics to actually manage those capabilities? We saw that first with the atomic bomb and atomic power, and now we see it with all kinds of advanced AI. And again, there are no, as you say in your book, there are no global structures to moderate this. There are no referees on the field who can blow the whistle, let alone assess a penalty.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things I say in the book also is that when we're pursuing the transformation that many people understand as necessary, it's important to look at the institutions that we have inherited for the past several centuries. The two main ones that I emphasize in the book are capitalism and the sovereign nation state system. My argument, and I'm wondering how you might respond to it, is that these institutions in the law, in all kinds of relationships among nations, they're institutionalized in the UN and so on. These institutions themselves condition human consciousness and will give us a pressure to think in ways that are deleterious to our possible evolutionary change.
Yeah, absolutely. In other words, we can be acting in ways that we think, or from particularly our worldview or the group we're a part of, that we think are adaptive, and actually they're maladaptive in the bigger picture. And in your book, which I don't think a lot of people are ready for yet, is that you point out, again, sovereignty and other issues, how to assess penalties or enforcement. Without those abilities, we're walking forward into more and more maladaptive situations that are just anarchical, by nature. But what happens then is a lot of the pushback that you end up getting as a pioneer is that even some of the best thinkers will go in, and instead of maybe addressing that, or maybe they do address that, but then they start to pick apart the solutions that you offer, because they might offer different solutions. And this is one of the other curious behavioral patterns that we've inherited from our chimp and bonobo heritage, is that we're always like, I'm running my fist together. People can't see this because we're on audio, but they used to always say, like, you have countries that have 50 political parties, and where there's 10 people, there's 1,000 points of view. Some are rational and some aren't. And if we're just a chattery bunch of chimps that are just arguing with each other over these details, and particularly the ego of who gets credit for what, Glen Martin wrote that initial vision, and I'm against that because, actually I had my own and my name should be on it. This is far more common than people realize, and even in the highest and best places of our global discourse. So I know the president of the Parliament of World Religions at a conference that I was a part of there said, let's be honest, the issue is ego. The issue is human ego. And it all boils down to that, even at the personal level of competition around ideas, and who gets credit for what and Nobel Prizes and all of this,
Yeah.
then we just have that baked into it.
It's true. It's very difficult. You read the visions of various thinkers and so on, and when they encounter something like my support for the Constitution for the Federation of Earth, they have an initial reaction that doesn't really allow for serious thought about it. Because for years I've been doing this, as you know, and people will criticize this provision, that provision. They say this is not adequate, that adequate. But what I emphasize is that our crisis is such that we need a tool. We need some mechanism for making decisions at a global level. And even if this one is not perfect, once it's initiated, it contains provisions for making changes, for improvements. It's a living document. It's not frozen in time. So nothing is really being imposed. But what the Constitution does is offer a tool for people to really move forward within the time frame that we're all beginning to feel is really getting shorter and shorter. We've got to move forward as quickly as possible, and the Constitution offers a way to do that. Does that kind of a reasoning make sense to you?
Yeah, and it actually points out one of the major issues that we're up against, and the way it's usually addressed is where are the lever points? In other words, where are the lever points for actually going forward? Because what happens is kind of what you're saying, just in the conversation now and even in your book, that civil society and thought leaders and circles of thought leaders have to come forward in a way that inspires and educates and visions that there's a way that we could move toward a global governance. But then the question comes up, because there's so many of those think tanks and groups, and we were just part of launching one yesterday, the SDG Thought Leaders Circle, which was such a great initial gathering. The question then comes out, how do those groups then get any traction in the real world of policy and where real decisions are made? And there we have the problem, which again, Rayanne Eisler and many others point to, that still globally, the standard for leadership in most countries is narcissistic people, even psychologically ill people who are all about serving themselves. They're egomaniacs and go through the whole list. And so many of our governments globally, where the decisions are made, are dictatorships and autocracies. They would actually be against, any of this thinking that's actually adaptive. So, this is exactly what the Dalai Lama pointed out. He said the bottom line is that the tractions of power are not where the values are, and the values are not where the tractions of power are. And if we don't get that right, then we can have all the think tanks in the world and the wonderful conversations like this one, which everybody would agree with and say, oh yeah, I get that. And yet you have no access to how decisions are actually made, which are then made even like stupidly, just to use the word.
Yeah. Just yesterday, I received in the mail the new book by James Gustav Speth called They Knew, the U.S. Federal Government 50 Years Role in Causing the Climate Crisis. And you may know his work. He's a major environmentalist, written a number of books. So the one I review in my book is called The Bridge at the End of the World, Capitalism and the Climate Crisis. And he, in this new book, he traces the initial breakthroughs during the Carter administration, where all this scientific information is coming together. James Hansen from NASA is putting together computer models showing the danger to human beings and so on. So you've got this wealth of information and the real awareness that people's lives, people's health is going to be progressively damaged and threatened by this. And then he goes through each of the administrations since that time, right down to the Trump administration, and shows that the federal government is really controlled by special interests, right? Super rich, big corporations, fossil fuel companies, and so on. So how do you get that conversation out, right? Just what you're saying, how to, if even a so-called democracy where we have some degree of ability to communicate without being thrown in jail, how do we get people to really get on the same page harmoniously and work together to transform this world? As maybe that's the biggest question.
Yeah, I think absolutely. No, I think absolutely that's the biggest question, because either people who are seeing clearly will be able to get into the areas where decisions are actually made, or they won't. And again, as lemmings, will just go off the cliff. And that may end up being being the epitaph on our planet. I know the founder of Spiral Dynamics, Don Beck, spoke at the UN a number of years ago. He was giving a report on where all the development levels are about in different countries, and showing that all of these potentials are there, but all it takes is one dictator or one administration that's narcissistic to set it all back 10 or 20 years. And what he said is the sad thing would be if we did go extinct and someone from another that history, that there were two tragedies that were involved. Is one, that we could not comprehend what we were up against. Thus, since we couldn't make the diagnosis, we couldn't write the prescription. And then the other was that, and this is even sadder, that the answers were there, but we weren't able to hear them. Now, as well as I do, all across the world, between integral and spiral dynamics and regenerative design, and we have at least 10 or 12 major schools of thinking that comprehensively and holistically diagnose the situation that we're in. But if the global population, not to mention the leaderships, cannot comprehend these, then that would be, like Don said, that would be the absolute tragedy. The answers were there, and we were not able to hear them. I know I was at a meeting at Center for Earth Ethics here in New York a number of years ago with Al Gore, and we had a kind of a small session over dinner, and we asked him, just for fun, what would the world look like if he would have won instead of Bush, both with regard to wars and the environment. And he rolled his eyes. He didn't even give an answer, because I think we all know that we lost we've had at least 3 administrations that did not pay any attention, at least adequately, to what was happening, with the global climate crisis. And then while they were doing that, we were incrementally losing that battle between the temperature increase and the things that are irreversible, that once they are there and are not irreversible, then, like they say, by whatever year, we're going to have 2 billion of our 9 billion people on the planet will be trying to live in areas that are truly non-inhabitable, both with regard to temperature and other general environmental situations. And and it's tough, because there was also a book out recently by 14 different scientists saying that one incapacity of our species is we don't have the ability to comprehend the implications of big data set. The big data sets can be out there, like on climate change or the economy, or where money's going with regard to nation building and war. But because we're so evolved to only see what's right in front of us and to solve what's right in front of us, that's it. It's baked into the way that we came from clans and tribes and all of this, and hunter-gatherer and all of this, that the data sets are there, and yet they're just shotgun blasts on a whiteboard. And we don't comprehend the implications. So I think, as you know, in my endorsement of your book, one of the things I said was, I quoted Carl Jung when he said that the way that we usually reach any of these thresholds, like the vision that's in your book, is that we zig and we zag, and we go forward and we go backward, and we zig and we zag. But eventually, in that zigging and zagging, we get there. At least to some degree. Like, you could say that was the history of the UN. We started out with the League of Nations, then we had to have another war with 90 million casualties in order to realize that, we need that, and then do that, and then it may not even function properly. So we're not a lot to brag about. One thing that people need to realize is that the discoveries of science in the last 7 years have been is that the evolutionary process is on our side. The understanding now of natural selection is that natural selection as competition and conflict is only true at the most primitive levels in evolution. Once you go to levels of complexity and to an intelligent species, the definition of fitness for survival of the fittest is cooperation. And nature will choose the best cooperator, not the best competitors. So we used to think that evolution was wind blowing in our face against what our hearts wanted. And now we understand that actually evolutionary process is at our backs. And it also, in that sense, is trying to go the same direction toward more and better adaptation, just like we are. So that's absolutely wonderful news. The last thing I'd say is find a place where you can engage in a meaningful community that gives you positive feedback toward wanting to be in favor of all of these proactive, pro-social, and adaptive views that we're talking about, and will give you the feedback to support you in taking a proactive role for those activities.
Excellent. Yes, I think that's a good note on which to end. That we somehow, all of us, need to be activated, and we're activated through cooperation, through solidarity with one another, and through a common vision. And that's what your career has been about, Kurt, and that's what my book is about as well. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and I appreciate very much your being on the podcast with me today.
Well, thanks, Glenn. It was really my pleasure.
To our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed today's dialogue about establishing a living future for the Earth and for all future generations. Our podcast has been recorded, and the link will be streamed to multiple social media outlets and posted on my own website at oneworldrenaissance.com. I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this exciting conversation. You can email me at gmartin@earthconstitution.world. This podcast has been made in association with Everscope Multimedia. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and that you will join us in Creativity in Crisis at the same time and place next week. Goodbye for now, be well, and God bless.